So, hello, homeschoolers of Maine and beyond. I'm joined today by Israel Wayne, who's the director of Family Renewal Ministry and the author of a number of books on parenting and homeschooling. Israel's a second generation homeschooler. He was homeschooled himself at a time when homeschooling was not yet legal, and he has a pretty fascinating and inspiring story. We obviously have more and more families choosing homeschooling, which is great, but not many know the history of homeschooling. Not many know how difficult it was to homeschool in the past or the legal battles that were fought just a generation ago to ensure homeschooling rights nationwide. And we feel it's so important that homeschoolers understand this history so that we can retain these rights and so that all that was fought for wasn't in vain. So in this thread, I'm hoping that Israel can share a little bit more about his story growing up.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, my family began homeschooling about 5 years before the modern day homeschooling movement began. The homeschooling movement actually was preceded by several different other movements. I guess I'll just back up real quick, give a quick history just so people kind of have the lay of the land. But if you go back to colonial America, most people were homeschooling or they were teaching in small cottage schools, which were really parent-directed, parent-run, parent-funded schools. And that changed in 1852 when Horace Mann created government schools. Some people call them public schools, but his model was far more appropriately named government schools because they were regulated by the government, controlled by the government, funded by government tax dollars. And increasingly over time, with his model, parents have had less and less say to the point where they have virtually no say today. And so the government around 1852, starting in Massachusetts, and by 1900, being implemented compulsory attendance laws in all the states, they created a monopoly where they had pretty much a lockdown on the educational system and forced all children to attend their schools, whether they wanted to or not. So, there was not freedom of choice in education beginning at the beginning of the 20th century. It wasn't until 1925 that the Catholics were able to get an exemption from compulsory attendance laws and to create their own parochial schools through a court case called Pierce versus Society of Sisters. And then the Protestant evangelicals began starting their Christian schools in the 1960s, kind of underground, but really without a lot of legal precedent to do so. And then in 1972, the Amish were able to win a court case called Wisconsin versus Yoder, which enabled them to create their parochial schools. And after that, the floodgates opened up for Protestant evangelicals to start Christian schools all over the country because they had the legal precedent of the Pierce versus Society of Sisters and Wisconsin versus Yoder. So that, created these private Christian schools, and of course you had Catholic and Amish schools. So there was kind of a precedent set for being able to opt out, particularly if you had a religious reason for doing so. And so 1977, John Holt began the unschooling movement in the United States with his Growing Without Schooling magazine, and began publishing materials for unschooling families who were not particularly religiously motivated. They just kind of had more of a libertarian bent of not wanting the government to tell them how to raise their children. But the unschooling movement was decentralized, kind of very intentionally. So it never really had like a central leader or any central organization that was the go-to. It was just like families kind of doing their own thing off grid. And so there were families that were doing it, but it didn't have the same kind of force to it, I guess you would say, as when the modern day official homeschooling movement started in 1983. My family started in 78. We hadn't heard really of unschooling or homeschooling at that time. My mom had taken my older sister out of public school. My mom was actually a high school dropout. She dropped out of school in ninth grade and had a bad experience in high school, so she wasn't really fond of the school system as it was. And then when my sister was being labeled as learning disabled, even though she entered kindergarten being able to read at a fifth grade level, my mother realized how out of touch the teachers were with her and her unique needs. And so she took my sister out of school and began teaching her at home. Well, I'm sorry, continued teaching her at home because she had been homeschooling her from birth. I mean, that's something that I think a lot of parents don't think about, is that really everyone homeschools. It's just that some people quit when their child reaches compulsory attendance age and they put them into school. But initially, everybody homeschools their child until at least age 6 or so. And so my mom just continued homeschooling her at home, not realizing that it wasn't a legal option. And so we had truancy officers and Child Protective Services show up at the door, threaten to, take my sister away from my mother, that she could lose custody of her, that she would be jailed for, truancy. It was scary back in those days. I mean, there was really a lot of threat on parents who did not comply to the compulsory attendance laws. And while there were families who were unschooling, and there were a few, what we would call more traditional homeschooling families that were doing it under the radar, nobody really knew anybody else that was doing it. I mean, it was just, you were just alone. And so there was nobody to call. There was no network. So long story short, we did go to court. The judge threw our case out and just dismissed it. And so there wasn't a ruling on it. So we didn't set precedent of any kind. I think he didn't want to go there, but he also saw that my mom was doing a good job in raising my sister and myself. And so we just kept homeschooling. We did get caught a few times after that. When I was in second grade, sixth grade, we again faced some legal situations. And it was in 1983 that the modern day homeschooling movement started, where more and more families were getting prosecuted. Homeschool Legal Defense Association was founded that year, and about 26 state homeschooling associations were founded, most of whom had homeschool conferences for the first time in 1983. And from that time, more and more awareness began related to homeschooling. Dr. James Dobson had Dr. Raymond Moore on Focus on the Family, and he talked with Dr. Moore, who was a homeschool advocate, about homeschooling. And of course, that brought awareness to a whole national audience that this was a thing. And so from that time, homeschooling grew from really, at most a few thousand families at most in the United States around 1982 to today, 40 years later. They estimate about 5 million students post-COVID. So the homeschooling movement has grown significantly over that time. In 1988, my mother started publishing a national homeschool magazine called Homeschool Digest. And that became one of the nation's longest running homeschooling magazines. And I worked for that publication for 20 years. And so anyway, I've worked my whole lifetime professionally in homeschool publishing, and have worked as an author and conference speaker within the homeschool world. So I was homeschooled as a student. My day job since January of 1993, which is almost 30 years, has been working in homeschool publishing. And then, my family is homeschooling today. So, kind of a brief history, I guess you will, of the modern day homeschooling movement and how we got to where we are.
Yeah, thank you so much for both the personal information and the historical information. I'm really glad that you pointed out that schooling and education existed and was happening at home before public compulsory education laws. And also that no matter what, even today, education is happening at home before kids are sent to school. Because I think a lot of parents who are just beginning homeschooling feel, that maybe they're not qualified, or how do I do this? Or so I think that's a good reminder that you have done this no matter what, in some form or another.
Can I say something else about that?
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I hear from people all the time who say, I don't think I'm qualified. I don't think I could homeschool my children. And, a couple of things I'd like to remind them is that really some of the most difficult things that you ever teach your children, you teach them before the age of 6. So, you teach them how to walk, how to talk, how to feed themselves with a fork, how to tie their shoes. In my personal opinion, if you can teach a child how to be potty trained, you should have an honorary PhD for teaching your child how to be potty trained. That's one of the most difficult things I think there is. You teach them their colors, their shapes, their numbers. They start to put together the building blocks for learning, and you do all of that at home, homeschooling them. And really, homeschooling is just an extension of parenting. It's not some other weird thing that you do. It's just parenting with academics. So you just keep parenting at home, and you just keep slowly adding academics. So just like you taught them their numbers and their shapes and their colors, you just start adding, okay, now we're going to deal with our phonetic blends, and we're going to look at our consonants, and going to start putting our phonograms together, and now we're going to do addition, and now multiplication, and you know what I mean? You just add block by block, layer by layer. So you don't just start doing some weird thing one day where all of a sudden you change your whole house to look like a classroom. You just keep parenting, and you add academics to it.
Yeah, I love that. Homeschooling is just an extension of parenting. So how do you think that your experiences growing up in a homeschooling family, and particularly at a time when it wasn't legal, when you were facing these, these things being brought to court, et cetera, how did that inform your decision to homeschool your own children?
Well, I think, for me as a student, I hesitate to say this because I don't want to disinterest your listeners. But I was not a great student. I was a difficult student in many ways. I was ADHD. I had dyslexia. I struggled. It took me forever to learn how to read. I didn't learn how to read till I was like 11. I just was one of these hyperactive, bouncing off the walls, easily distractible students. The classroom setting was a travesty for me. Again, in second grade and sixth grade, we got caught homeschooling, and so rather than going to jail, my mom put us in private Christian school for a year and then pulled us out at the end of the year. We went underground and started homeschooling again, moved, and started homeschooling again. So I did have some experience in a traditional classroom, not a government school, but a private school. And it just was a colossal failure for me. My older sister, who was a very complacent, compliant, kind of easy to parent child, she did pretty well academically in a school setting and fit into that environment fairly well. I totally did not. And so it was only because I was homeschooled that I was able to learn how to read. Because if I'd have been sent to a special class or, had been labeled as learning disabled or something like that, I just would have given up and I just wouldn't have tried. I would have shut down, sort of to punish the system, if you will. I just had that personality type. So homeschooling for me was a lifesaver. And so I kind of knew that intrinsically, even though I didn't like schooling because I wasn't a good student. I knew that I liked homeschooling a whole lot better than being in a classroom, and that it worked for me a lot better. So I had a commitment coming out of high school that I would homeschool my own children. And so how did homeschooling influence my decision to homeschool? It actually influenced the decision for who I was going to marry, because I was committed, even as an older teenager, that I would not marry someone who was not 100% supportive of homeschooling. That was a deal breaker for me. Like, there was no way that I was going to send our children to a school, and so if the person that I was marrying was kind of like, well, I don't know, maybe school's fine, I would be like, okay, that's fine, but you need to find somebody else to spend your life with, because that's not an option for me as a parent. So I met my wife, Brooke. I was 23, she was 20. Her family had started homeschooling in Arizona in 1983. Her mom was a co-founder of the Arizona State Homeschool Association. And so her mom had heard Dr. Raymond Moore on the radio in 1983 and had become friends with him and was very influenced by his educational philosophy. And so my wife was homeschooled, all the way through. And so we had very similar beliefs and values when we met. And I think that kind of attracted us to each other, that we respected each other and just saw that we were headed in the same direction, and that we had the same kind of vision for family and for how we wanted to educate our children. So both of us were 1000% committed to homeschooling before we met each other. And therefore, together we were supportive. So there was never a question for us as to whether we would homeschool our children or not. There were the questions for us interesting were more like, which curriculum would we use? Because there were things that she grew up liking that I hated. Like, I'll just throw this out just for fun. My wife, for some odd reason that I still cannot explain to this day, actually likes Saxon math. I know, it's bizarre. Uh, I hated Saxon math. I so wish like math UC had been a thing when I was growing up, because when I saw that program as an adult, I was like, I could have learned math using this program. So conceptually, like my brain works completely different than hers in some academic areas. And so there were things like that we had to come to, and ended up, honestly, it was this question of, we're going to use the things that I liked or the things that you liked with our children. And honestly, for most of it, the homeschooling movement has grown and changed so much. And there's so many great new resources that weren't designed for classrooms, but were designed actually for the home learning environment, that cost less, take less time, or just way more efficient and more interesting, that we've actually kind of settled on things, a lot of things that we found ourselves very thankful for, the things that we grew up with, the traditional classroom textbooks that we grew up with. But we've tended to find things that were more created by homeschoolers for homeschoolers. We found those things have worked a lot better for us. So for us, the question of, are we going to homeschool our children was analogous to us asking, will we feed them and clothe them? It's like, well, of course we will homeschool them. It wasn't because to us, homeschooling wasn't some weird other thing. Homeschooling was just life. It was just how we were raised. We understood it. We got it. So we didn't have to like unlearn a classroom school model. We knew how to homeschool, and so we had a great advantage in that way, and definitely, absolutely, helped me not only have a commitment that I wanted to teach my own children, but also to advocate for it as an author and conference speaker, because I benefited so much from it myself, and then watching our children benefit from it as well has motivated me to be a kind of national advocate for home education.
That's a pretty incredible success story in favor of homeschooling. If struggling with these learning disabilities, could not read until you were 11, and now part of your work is writing.
Well, it is an interesting twist, right? So one last thing with that. So when I was 12, my mom had 6 children, and she said, I think I'm going to be very soon a single parent. I think we're going to be on our own here very soon, because she was in an abusive marriage and it just wasn't a good situation. And so she said, I need to find something that I can do to be able to support the family from home. And so it was the next year after that, when I was 13, that she started Homeschool Digest magazine, which took off and became, a really international success. And so my mom was actually a publisher and editor. So I grew up in that environment. But my mom was an incredible businesswoman, and she was a really good writer. She was a really good editor. She was a conference speaker, author, editor, back in the 80s and 90s. And so I grew up in that kind of environment. And that was actually kind of a burden for me a little bit, because my mom somehow was, even though she, was this single parent high school dropout, which everybody says, well, what about the single parents who can't homeschool? And, what if you don't have a high school diploma? Or, what if you're not wealthy? Well, we weren't wealthy. My mom decided that after she did become a single parent, that we were not going to live on government assistance. And we only had $100 a month in child support. So, how do you make it, right? How do you support 6 kids and stay at home? And thank God the business took off for her. But it was a challenge for me, because writing was really hard. I mean, anything related to grammar, language arts, reading, writing, spelling, I was horrible at all of it. People ask me, well, what writing program do you recommend? And honestly, I flunked all of them. I think they're all terrible. It's really not. It's not that they're terrible. I wasn't good at it. I was horrible at it. But after I graduated from high school, I just had things that I wanted to say. I've always been a communicator. And so I learned how to write, and it was very difficult. I had to work hard at it. I put in an awful lot of effort, but I actually learned how to write because I had a reason. I had something I wanted to say. And so my mom was a big inspiration, I think just in life, even in terms of that you can achieve what you want to if you put your mind to it. And basically, you just have to determine what it is that you want and be consistent and work toward it, and don't give up. And so, people often again say, well, not everybody can homeschool. Well, if my mom, a ninth grade single parent dropout, could successfully homeschool 6 kids, with virtually no income at a time when homeschooling was illegal and there were very little resources available, I truly think most people can homeschool. It's just most people don't have the want to. And my mom had made a commitment that she was going to keep us out of government schools. I mean, for her, that was her personal conviction. She said, I'm not ever going to send my kids to a government school. It won't happen. So for her, because she closed that door, she found a way. And I think that's really true of a lot of things. It's like if you totally make a commitment in a certain direction and you just say, I'm 100% in on this, you find a way. Doors open, things happen, miracles happen. You find a way to make something happen that you didn't think could. And it really comes down to commitment, because if you don't have that commitment, then when things get difficult, you'll go with the easiest path. And, it's like any kind of goal. I mean, if you have a weight loss goal, if you're not really tenaciously committed to that weight loss goal, then if there's a chocolate cake there, you're going to sit down and eat the whole thing for lunch. That's how it goes. But it's that level of commitment. How committed are you to this? And so, you have to sacrifice things, certainly, to achieve some goals, especially if you want to homeschool your kids. It's going to cost you. You'll have to do without some things. You have to say no to some things. But the question is, what are your priorities? And I think for my wife and I, we adopted the same kind of priority that my mom did, that our kids are our number one priority. And we're just not going to compromise on that. There are other things that we can say no to, but we won't say no to them and their education.
That's such a great reminder for our families that homeschooling families can look really different and have weathered, incredible difficulties. And I think, it's a great reminder too, or a great encouragement, that, right, if you're choosing the right thing, things are going to fall into place.
Can I share something else on that too?
Yeah.
I think this would be helpful for listeners to consider my mom's philosophy. So again, I remember when my mom was 12, she said, you're getting ready to go into high school. And she said, you're probably wondering, how am I going to teach you high school when I dropped out of school in ninth grade? Because you're going to be learning subjects that I never studied. And I said, yeah, that actually did occur to me. How are you going to do that? And she said, well, here's the thing. She said, I don't have to teach you how to learn. You know how to learn. She said, I've made a few commitments to you. I've taught you how to read, which was very difficult, but I've taught you how to read. And if you know how to read and you know how to think and you know how to study, you can teach yourself. So there's that ancient Chinese proverb of you can give a man a fish or you can teach him how to fish. And if he learns how to fish, he can feed himself for life rather than you feeding him for a day. And that was my mom's educational philosophy. And she was tenaciously committed to that. So what she would say to me was, you know how to study, you know how to learn, you know how to find the information that you need. So basically all I have to do is follow the coursework, use an answer key, the teacher guide and the answer key, which tells me all the answers, whether you got them right or not. And at that time, I actually did video school, which was pretty progressive, I guess you'd say, for that time in the 80s. So in some ways, it was like me being in a class. But I got a really high quality education at home with my single parent mom. She was focused on teaching my younger sisters who were elementary age. And she said, I just don't have time to hold your hand through high school. You're going to teach yourself, and this will be what you make of it. If you want to waste your time and waste your life, that's on you. But if you want to make something of this, then you have an opportunity. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to provide you with an opportunity to learn. I can't make you want to learn, but I can provide you with an opportunity, and then what you do with it is up to you. So my mom was a huge advocate of being self-taught and also having that mentality going forward into adulthood. So most of the things that I've learned in life that have been really useful, I learned after high school, because I had that continuing education mentality of I don't quit learning as soon as I get a diploma, which in those days they didn't give you diplomas because homeschooling wasn't recognized yet. But at any rate, but you don't stop learning as soon as you get a diploma. You learn throughout life. And so I think that's another thing that a lot of parents don't understand about homeschooling, is that your goal is not to teach your child everything there is to know in the universe, because you can't possibly do that, and they'll forget most of it anyway, because we only remember the things that we use. And most of the things that they teach us in school, we never use in real life. So we forget it all. It's not really that practically useful for us. But if you teach your children how to think and how to learn and how to study, how to teach themselves, then that's your goal. And if you do that, they can learn anything.
Yeah, that's a great answer. I'm going to switch gears a little bit here and ask you, what do you think, having seen the past in homeschooling and being a homeschool parent in the present, and interacting with lots of homeschoolers all the time, what do you think is the biggest challenge facing homeschoolers today?
Oh, there's a bunch, but I think what I'm feeling probably the most right now, I'm on the board of a state homeschool association here in Michigan. I'm vice president. And so what we do as a state homeschooling association is we help to defend homeschooling freedoms so that people can make choices about how they feel it's best to educate their own children. And we do believe those decisions are best left with the parents. We think parents know their children better than anyone else. They care the most about their children. They love their children the most. So we believe educational decisions are best left in the hands of parents, not bureaucrats. But we just had an election, and basically there's two risks when you look at political parties. You have two teams, if you will, two political parties, and blue team always wants to regulate homeschooling, and red team always wants to give homeschoolers government money. And there's downsides to both. The issue with regulation is that no matter how much regulation you have, it's never enough for some politicians. So even New York State, for example, which is, I think, probably the most regulated state in the United States related to homeschooling, every year they have lobbyists who are pushing for additional homeschool regulation, even in New York State. The most regulated state in the country, and they're saying it's not enough, we need more. The other thing is that there are studies that have been done on academic achievement for homeschoolers, and they find that there's really no advantage academically for students who are in highly regulated states versus low regulation states. So like one of the least regulated states in the US is Oklahoma, for example. Michigan is also a very low regulation state. And homeschoolers in Oklahoma and Michigan do not score lower on achievement tests than homeschoolers in high regulation states like New York and Pennsylvania. So people assume that they would, because they think, well, they need additional oversight and they need the government, giving them all this red tape and hoops to jump through and all of that. But in reality, it doesn't correlate to academic success for the students. The homeschoolers tend to do just as well in low regulation state. It just makes it more difficult. It's just more, needless, bureaucracy for parents to have to deal with. So we're, as a state association, we're of the mentality that, we need to have the lowest amount of regulation and just let parents do their thing. And so I think that's the mentality that we have when related to the blue team. When it comes to the red team, they're usually like, hey, we love homeschoolers. We want to be your friends. We think we can get you government money. And so what we have to do is tell red team, you know what, we appreciate that you like homeschoolers and that you want to help. But, I think Ronald Reagan said that one of the scariest phrases in the English languages, we're from the government and we're here to help. So we have to tell the red team, if you really want to help us as homeschoolers, what you need to do is just leave us alone. That's the best way you can possibly help us, is just leave us alone, because whatever the government pays for, it controls and it regulates. And so we've seen a number of situations that I probably don't have time to go into here with private schools and other groups where they've taken government money, and it's turned around to be a tremendous amount of control. I just read an article recently in New York. There are these Hasidic schools where there are Jewish students who are learning in Hasidic schools, and in New York State they took over, I think it was 4 years time, $1 billion in government funding. And now the government is coming after them saying they need to be severely regulated and that they need to be standardized so that they teach all the same things that the government schools teach because they're getting government money. Well, the whole purpose for them as Hasidic schools is that they don't want to teach all the things the government schools teach at the same time in the same way as the government schools, because they don't want to be a government school. They want to be their own religious school. And so, but they wanted the money. And so in doing so, they basically have now created a scenario where the government's calling for regulation and oversight and saying, you basically need to standardize and become like the government school and do everything the government school does in the same ways the government school does it because we own you. You know, that's their argument. So we really highly recommend that homeschooling families avoid both of those ditches, you know, of allowing the state to create needless regulations on the one hand, and then, you know, taking the bait of government money on the other hand, because it does look enticing and people feel like, well, it's my tax dollars and so forth. But again, once the government takes your money, they see it as their money. And when they give some of it back to you, it always has strings attached to it and government control attached to it. So if you truly want to have educational freedom, you have to pay for the education out of your own pocket.
Yeah, very true. What do you think the solution is for this, for you know, just ordinary individual homeschool families as opposed to organizations? What can they do to protect homeschool freedom and kind of navigate between these two warring parties that don't necessarily have either, you know, the interests of homeschooling, the best interests of homeschooling in mind? Obviously, just not taking money is an easy answer, or not easy maybe to do, but an obvious answer. But in terms of, you know, government oversight or restrictions on homeschooling, what can ordinary families do?
Well, this book that I wrote, Answers for Homeschooling, Top 25 Questions Critics Ask, this book legitimately answers basically every question that you could possibly raise related to home education. And I have a whole section in here on the government funding issue, because again, people I think feel like, well, if we had vouchers or we had, you know, the money following the child, or, you know, today in a Michigan homeschool group that I admin for our state association, a mom asked, is there a way that we can deduct the expenses that we spend on homeschool curriculum? Can we deduct that from our taxes? And so there's all these questions that people have about, you know, what about education savings accounts, ESAs, and so forth. I address all that in that book, Answers for Homeschooling, as well as all the other questions about, am I qualified? What about socialization? How do you choose a curriculum? What are all the different homeschooling approaches of classical approach and Charlotte Mason and eclectic and unschooling and all those kinds of traditional textbook, unit study? You know, I address everything, literally everything in that book. So I encourage people, grab a copy of that online. It's just called Answers for Homeschooling. You can get it anywhere that books are sold, or on our website, which is familyrenewal.org. But I think that the biggest thing is that parents have to understand the why behind that, because it makes sense on one level to say, well, but we pay for the schools and we're not getting any benefit out of it. So shouldn't we get something back? And so in that book, I really just outlined in a more complete way than I can do here why it is that as homeschoolers, you have to work within a system that I agree is unfair, that you're having to pay twice. You know, you're paying for everybody else's children to be educated and you're paying for your own. I get that. But why the solution for that is not that we want to have our hand out waiting for the government to give us alms, because, you know, with shekels come shackles. And so we don't want to go down that road, but you have to understand the ideology behind that. And so I would really recommend people grabbing a copy of that Answers for Homeschooling book, because I think it'll help them to answer questions in their own mind just about homeschooling in general. But also that book is written really to help refute a lot of the arguments against homeschooling, or even arguments of why should homeschooling be regulated, or why shouldn't homeschooling be regulated? Like here in Michigan, we have a legislature now after this election that really wants to regulate homeschooling, and a lot of homeschooling families, parents on Facebook are saying, well, I think it's a good idea. I think we should have government oversight over homeschool. You can't just have parents teaching their children anything they want. Oh, really? Okay. So the government can teach your children anything that they want, and the parents have no say. But for some reason, we're going to be innately suspicious of parents teaching their own children their own beliefs and values. Okay. So I think there really is a sense in which even a lot of parents have kind of bought into this idea that the children belong to the government and that the government knows what is best and that the government needs to be the ones raising our children. And, and so I think we need to develop the right kind of educational philosophy where we realize how important it is that we give education back to parents. We've just been indoctrinated into statism for 200 years in America. And so, we're kind of swimming in that now, this idea that we can't do anything without government. We can't do anything unless the government gives us permission. We have to, go get a permit or ask permission before we do simple things like teach our children. And these are things that for thousands of years were just natural, understood by natural law, that this is the right of parents to direct the training and upbringing of their children. And we even have it in some of our state constitutions. I mean, Oklahoma has it, Michigan has it. We have it in our state constitution, but it's the fundamental right of parents to direct the upbringing and education of their children. We have it in some of our founding documents, but we've just gotten away from it now to where we really see that the state is the ones who own the children, and we basically have to get permission from them to raise our own kids. And so we've got to get back to some principles that we've lost over time in our country.
Wow. Yeah. Thank you. Well, thank you so much for, helping us understand all that and hopefully helping other families out there understand, the whys and hows of homeschooling and how it came about and all the good reasons for it and how it's innately tied to our responsibility as parents too, I think. And thank you so much for sharing your valuable time and your valuable perspective. And we thank homeschoolers out there viewing us. We thank you for your devotion to your families. And we thank you for standing with us to ensure that homeschooling freedoms remain secure.